How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. I hope you guys are having a great day. In this video, I want to kind of talk about a really important aspect of learning how to programming. And if you're a beginner, I definitely recommend you watch this because this advice will be really useful. So the tip that I want to give you today, or the advice I want to give you all, is learn how to stay focused on learning one technology at a time. I think what I see a lot happen, and this actually happened to me, is as you can see, I have 102 repositories with a bunch of random stuff in it, right? I have an issue with just staying focused on learning like one tech stack and becoming really good at it. I jumped around from different languages, and I'll tell you my history about jumping around in a bit. But I think I see this a lot online, and people just asking like, what programming language should I learn, or what should I focus on, or how do I become a web developer? And honestly, there's so many different ways to become a programmer. There's so many different languages. Like this is just a small subset of all the languages that are out there, and they all have their own particular uses. And it could be really overwhelming and frustrating as a beginner when you keep seeing on social media that you should learn Java, or you should learn Perl, or JavaScript, or TypeScript, or React, or Vue, or Angular, and stuff like that. And it could be kind of confusing, especially since you don't know what these are and if they're important or not, or if there's jobs in those languages or in those frameworks. So ultimately, you got to do some research for yourself. You got to go to Indeed.com, Monster.com, search from keywords, search Python jobs versus JavaScript jobs, or React versus Angular. And you kind of need to see for yourself, like, what should I learn to get a job in my particular city? Or if you're open to moving, like, what job should you learn in regards to if you live in the US or if you live in like India or something. Although I don't really know how a lot of things work overseas, I could just kind of talk to in the US. But again, the main piece of advice I'm getting at is just like, if you're trying to get into web development, like just focus on one technology at a time. Like focus on starting to learn HTML. So like search HTML docs. Nope, I can't spell that. W3 Schools, people bash on the site, but really like, if you want to learn the basics, like go through here and learn how to code with HTML. Like learn what all the different tags mean, like what the properties you can attach to the tags. Now, I'm not saying you have to learn every single one, but at some point you need to know like 60, 70, 80% of these, so that if you're scrolling through someone else's code and you see a canvas tag, you're not like, well, what's a canvas for? It's for rendering like actual pixels onto a canvas, or drawing geometric shapes, stuff like that. It's a lot more efficient at rendering. All right, so over here, like your HTML objects, a lot of these you should know. Before you even start touching CSS, you should know how to build out a website like using these HTML objects. Even if it's a single column website, you can even hack with a table and get it to be multiple columns if you want to. But you need to know like what a lot of these are, like what forms are, input boxes, how do you make radio boxes, what is a header, what is a section element. You have all these inputs, right? And you should kind of have a decent understanding of when you'd use them or what they're used for. And again, this advice is like, I'm just talking about web development right here, but this kind of applies to anything. If you want to get into the field of programming or software engineering, you really need to just learn one tech stack at a time, or one piece of technology at a time, and learn it pretty well. Like don't just learn it a couple of days and then move on to something else, unless you're that capable of learning something that quick. But HTML, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here. It might take you a week or 2 or 3 to learn like all the different tags, all the different properties you can pass into a tag, HTML5 validation that's on inputs, stuff like that. And once you feel like you have a really good understanding of HTML, then you can say to yourself, let's move on to CSS and learn that by itself, right? I'll use it in combination of HTML because they kind of go hand in hand. But focus on just CSS. I mean, you can click up here, CSS, and you can actually go through this tutorial, learn what selectors are, learn the syntax, learn about colors, margins, padding. What I'm worried about right now is that there's this new hype on this library called Tailwind. And I think what a lot of beginners are going to do is they're just going to quickly default to installing Tailwind, and they won't actually understand how CSS works. And the same thing happened with Bootstrap, right? A lot of beginners will just go ahead and download Bootstrap and put it on their project, but they don't understand how media query works. They don't understand how like responsive layouts works. They don't even know how to like scale pixels based on, I don't know, like a vmin or VH, like the height of your window or the width of your window. And there's a lot of stuff that you kind of need to know, in my opinion, before you can move on to those libraries or those frameworks that help abstract all the basics for you. Those are basically built, those libraries like React, Bootstrap, Tailwind, they're built for more advanced programmers or web developers who don't want to waste as much time dealing with the lower level CSS or the lower level HTML or the DOM manipulation using JavaScript. right? Those libraries just help people who already understand what they're doing perform better, or I guess be more productive. So again, after you learn CSS, like, and you say to yourself, well, how do I make it so when I click on a button, like something cool happens? Or how do I make animations happen on my page? Well, then you move on to the next step, which is just JavaScript. Now this one, it's going to take some time, right? This is an actual like legit programming languages. You got variables, functions, conditional logic, Boolean logic, recursion operators. You have all these different things that you have to learn. And this piece of technology will take you quite a while, right? You're not going to learn this in a couple of weeks. This takes months and months and months to learn. For the average person, maybe even years. I'm still learning stuff about JavaScript because it's always changing. They're always adding new features. So this, just to give you some insight of how I fell into this trap, like if you look, I have 102 repositories over many, many years, and a lot of these are in different languages. I have like some in JavaScript, I think some in TypeScript, some in Python. I'm sure there's some in some esoteric language that I don't actually use. Like I got some in Vue. What else do I got? I have one in C. Oh, that's a fork. So I've done some work in C++ to kind of learn about OpenCV. But I'll give you a real quick recap of like where. Oh, here's CoffeeScript. Here's one in CoffeeScript. Like I did CoffeeScript for a while professionally. So just to give you a quick overview of like the path I took, I started off in like middle school where I learned something called Pawn. I think it was called Pawn, and it's kind of like a C language, but I used it to kind of script for Half-Life servers. So if you don't know what Half-Life is, it's a game where you can host a server, you can have people. Let me type in Half-Life game. I'm sure you've seen this if you're if you play any type of games. Half-Life 1, so like basically people make custom mods and you can kind of write your own scripts with them. So I kind of like dabbled in that, although I had no idea what I was doing. But then I moved on to other classes in high school where I learned the basics of HTML and CSS. And then I also learned Visual Basic. So Visual Basic is another language that is like a Visual Basic drag and drop. Let's see. So it's literally like you have this thing where you can drag and drop input boxes and labels, and you can like add listeners. So if someone were to click on this input box, you can run a function. And that's kind of what I started learning with. I learned with Visual Basic. And then I kept jumping around from language to language. Like I started learning about ASP. I got hired for a small ASP job where I was just basically grabbing data from a SQL database, rendering out with an ASP template, and showing that to the user, like with the typical model view controller website. And then through that, I learned PHP, where I basically did the same thing. And at some point, I started learning JavaScript because I wanted the web page to be interactive. So I started like learning about Ajax and how to make requests to a backend. And then I learned about like REST, and I moved on to Node.js because that was a hype thing back then. Basically, what I'm getting at is I kept jumping from language in language. And then in college, like we had to learn Java. So we learned a lot about object-oriented programming. I learned that in high school. In college, we learned Java. And then we had to learn C in college as well. So like every year I was basically learning a new a new piece of technology. And there's pros and cons of that, right? The pros is that once you learn one piece of technology, it really helps you understand these other pieces of technology, right? So since I learned ASP, it was really easy to learn PHP because it's just a syntax change, right? It's the same concepts. You do a model view controller to grab data and render it out to a web page. And then the object-oriented programming concepts of Java applies to like JavaScript in a way, where you have these classes and these classes have methods on them, and those methods kind of change the internal state of your objects, stuff like that. So I guess that's the main pro of like jumping around and learning all these languages, is that you get a really shallow understanding of all the different pieces of technology and how they kind of evolve and interact with each other. But the main con is you don't get a solid understanding of the ins and outs of the language, right? There's still stuff about JavaScript that I'm still learning today. I've been coding for quite a long time, but there's still things that I come across in JavaScript where I'm like, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that. It's like one of them is like the money sign operator in JavaScript. I don't even know what the name of that is, but basically if you have like a variable, let me go over here. So if you have a variable and you do like const age is equal to person question dot of age or something like that, where it basically makes sure that person is defined before it tries to grab the age property and prevents an error. I didn't know JavaScript supported this until just a couple of months ago. I don't really use it that often, but it's just like stuff like that. You keep learning new features about a language that if I just sat down for months, like 2 or 3 months, and read through all the ES6 features, all the ES6, ES5, but what I'm getting at is if I just sat down and like spent 2 months, 3 months learning like deep dive knowledge of how JavaScript works or how HTML works, like all the HTML tags, all the properties, all the CSS properties. Like you see me doing a lot of CSS battles where I might not be doing stuff in the most efficient ways. So for CSS battle, like, I might be doing something where I could probably just add a border and do like some after or before pseudo selectors, but I don't do them because A, maybe I just don't really know that they're there, or B, I just don't think about them because I haven't been doing them that much. I use these other languages and libraries that help abstract all that away from me. Like whenever I start a new project, I literally just go to Bootstrap. Like I default to Bootstrap. No matter what the project it is, I just go ahead and download Bootstrap. And the reason I do that is because it just makes stuff a lot quicker for me, right? I don't have to sit there and do custom media queries for all my different responsive layouts. I can just grab Bootstrap. I already know how the columns work, how the rows work. And at the end of the day, like it doesn't matter if you use Bootstrap or Tailwind, or at work we use something called USA or WDS, USWDS. So at work, we have to use something like this. So we can't use Bootstrap. We actually have to use this design system that was built for government projects. And it's very similar to Bootstrap. You have like columns and rows and responsive grids and layouts and stuff like that. But again, it's like, it doesn't really matter if you learn Bootstrap, Tailwind, or this. They all build upon each other. And no matter what you get hired for, you're going to have to do whatever your senior engineers decided that you need to do, or your project leader decided that we need to use this because that's the standard. So if I was to kind of go back and do it again, I think I would have just spent a lot more time doing a deep dive on these different technologies that I use, like really understand HTML, really understand CSS, really understand JavaScript. And then once you learn that next piece of tech, like React, really dive in and read through all the docs and understand how React works. Don't just get a shallow understanding, like don't just learn how to use a couple hooks. Don't just learn how to maybe use prop drilling. Like really understand React, how it works, why you do certain things, why you might want to use context, why you might want to use state, when you might want to bring in Redux or bring in some other third-party state management tool, or when you decide to use something like Cerebral.js to kind of control all of your logic. There's a lot that goes into it. So again, like this whole talk, the whole purpose of this video is if you're a beginner, just focus on learning one thing at a time. Don't get distracted with all the cool technologies that are published every 6 months. Don't feel stressed that you have to learn Tailwind. Don't feel stressed that you have to learn Go if you just spent a year learning Node. Most of these pieces of technology stay around for a very long time. A great example is like COBOL, right? People are still writing COBOL. This was like created like 60 years ago. So if you get hired at a bank, you might be writing something in COBOL if you're actually dealing with like mainframes or anything like that. It's probably unlikely, but it's still around. So although people say that PHP is going to die out or PHP is dead, it's not dead. Tons of people still use PHP. Like everything that uses WordPress is in PHP, right? So the main takeaway is like ignore all this noise. Just focus on the stack that will help you build something, right? Because it doesn't really matter what you learn. You learn Python, cool. Just stick with Python then. For 2 years, 3 years, just keep learning Python and become really good at it. And I guarantee you, if you go into an interview and they start drilling you on Python questions, you're going to do great because you've spent so much time just focusing on Python, right? Now, if you only spent like 2 months on Python and you switched to 2 months of JavaScript and then you spent 2 months of Go, all it takes is an interview to ask you one question that stumps you and you look like you're incompetent. Although you do have a shallow understanding of all these languages, if you can't explain like recursion in Go or something, or how to do package management in Go or package management in JavaScript, they're going to see that you're inexperienced in that particular piece of technology. I hope this talk was kind of useful. I hope it kind of gives you insight of what you should do if you're trying to learn how to code. Just, again, don't fall for what I did. Don't follow the same path I did. I would definitely recommend that you just focus on one thing and learn it well, and then keep adding a new piece of technology once you feel like you have a solid understanding. All right, thank you so much for watching, y'all. Happy coding.